can we ever trust the banks again? Unbelievable story, this. Calls this morning for the Barclays boss Bob Diamond to resign after the bank was fined £290 million for manipulating interest rates. Traders at the bank lied to make it look more secure during the financial crisis, and in many cases they worked with traders at other banks to make a profit. Now, we're always being told it's wrong to bash the bankers. Here's what Barclays boss Bob Diamond told MPs last year.
There was a period of remorse and apology for banks. I think that period needs to be over. We need our banks willing to take risk, confident, working with the private sector in the UK so that we can create jobs.
Oh, really? Well, Bob Diamond has apologised for this latest scandal. He's going to forgo his bonus. That's good of him. But many think that's not enough.
This is the most corrosive failure of moral behaviour that I have seen in a major UK financial institution in my career.
That's the former Financial Services Secretary, Lord Miners. Others think we need to get tougher with those who've done wrong. Here's the former Lib Dem Treasury spokesman, Lord Oakeshott.
Bob Diamond, who now runs the whole of Barclays, was directly responsible running Barclays Capital between 2005 and 2007, the time when these appalling activities were going on. And frankly, if he had any shame, he would go. If the Barclays board has any backbone, they'll sack him.
Well, Justin Stewart is from Seven Investment Management. Justin, explain to us what happened here.
Good morning. Well, LIBOR stands for London Interbank Offered Rate, but the whole basis of it is to establish a rate which the banks can then lend between themselves. And what happens is every day, and this is typically British in its rather sort of amateur way, they phone round the Bank of England will phone round between 8 and 16 banks and establish their current rates. And they will then take an average of those rates. And that effectively is the base rate, which a lot of us will then be using for our borrowing. So, for instance, when you often as a company for borrowing, it'll be X% over LIBOR. So that LIBOR rate is absolutely crucial. So that will affect everything from your personal loans, mortgages, through to company lending, right the way through. So this is a fundamental element of as to how you run a money system.
But if they were putting in lower figures, then surely that benefits us all.
Well, they might have been the case, or were they putting in higher ones? Or more to the point, were they just colluding with the others? Because the whole point is the banks shouldn't share this data between them. So they know full well that actually then there's a level of independence and there's a market, and they're not acting as a sort of to try and rig the market overall. Now, we don't know the details of all of this yet, but this would certainly seem to be the case, and therefore other banks will be involved. And what it means is something that was being carried out, say, 20 years ago in a more gentlemanly period when people could trust what was going on, has now been left to a bunch of dealers who were trading for their own benefit and obviously not being managed properly. Dealers behave as dealers behave. It's the management that's crucial here, and in my view this goes right the way through to senior management, because if they did know what was going on, they're responsible, and if they didn't know what was going on, they're still responsible. And this is fundamental not just in terms of our loans and those facilities, but actually the respect in which British financial services and banking in Scotland and England is held in high esteem. But not with scandals like this. This affects the one vital word in banking and financial services, integrity.
Yeah. I mean, this is a crisis, really, isn't it?
Well, it is a crisis, because this has been around. I've been writing about the stupidity of LIBOR for years, because it's sort of happy amateur week. You phone round and get a few rates and find out what's going on. Is this really how you find out the cost of money every day? Is it clear and honest and open and people can trust what was going on? No, it was a bit of an old club. And I'm afraid we need to be, and the Americans are furious over this, and they think all of this should be done away with, and I have to say they agree. And I agree, and also they tend to see this as a criminal act as well, in the same way that if you've been rigging a casino, therefore you'd have been held up for a criminal act, therefore are the banks doing the same here?
Yeah, Johnson Kippen, what do you think should happen?
Good morning. I think the idea of asking Bob Diamond to resign is farcical. I think the police should arrest these people, and they should be prosecuted, and they should probably land up going to jail. I would agree with the gentleman who's just been on. This is serious, organised criminal activity for the benefit of the people who are running the organisation, the top-end bankers. And if someone like Bob Diamond holds his hand up and says, I didn't know this was happening, That's his fault. I run my own business, and if someone lower down the ranks is doing something wrong, it's up to me to find out what's going on. I run the organisation. He runs that organisation, and I think at the end of the day he should be arrested.
Michael Hughes is an independent economist and former chief investment officer at Barings. You can't trust the banks, can you?
Well, most of them you can most of the time, but clearly not all of them all of the time. And I think that all that's been said this morning is absolutely right, that this is an activity which has affected so many people, perhaps very indirectly, but the very fact that it has affected them suggests that some heads have to roll and some further investigations need to take place.
Do you think people should be jailed?
It isn't just about Barclays, by the way. It's probably other banks as well.
Do you think people should be jailed as a result?
Well, it depends whether you regard this as a criminal offence. At the moment, it's a civil matter, and hence the fines that we've seen. If there is a sense of collusion, and indeed if people have personally gained on the back of it, then I think that's a very grey area, and I think it does need to be pursued.
Right, OK. Well, can we trust the bankers? 0500 92 95 00. Michael there saying that we can trust the banks most of the time anyway. What do you think, and what should happen to those who've been found guilty at Barclays? 0500 92 95 00. Take your calls after the news.
80295.
And you're listening to Call Kaye on BBC Radio Scotland with Graham Stewart all this week. Can we ever trust the banks? Alec is calling from Lochainver. Good morning, Alec.
Morning, Graham.
Well, what do you think about this? Barclays Bank and all this collusion to manipulate the interest rates?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't come as any surprise to lots of us, and in fact, those in the know, like Robert Peston, etc., have been aware of these problems for some time, and obviously investigations are going on into the other banks as to whether this has been happening there. But there's one area that I think needs further investigation, and that is the role of bank auditors. There are 5 major bank auditing firms internationally who now have an extremely cosy relationship with the banks, and yet a bank auditor should be someone trusted to ensure that the annual statements of bank accounts are a true and accurate and truthful representation of the state of that company. And clearly this has not been happening. I mean, apart from the current today's news on Barclays, huge black holes appeared in bank accounts right around the world because of the suspect nature of them trading in these securitized debt obligations, or whatever you want to call them. And bank auditors should have been aware of this. They should have been spotting this. They should have been more on top of the situation and asking questions and raising doubts about the way banks are trading, and they simply didn't.
Yeah, Michael Hughes, our independent economist, where were the auditors?
Well, I think the wider question is the whole compliance culture of banks. And I suspect that they have become so complex, and some of the instruments that they've designed and traded are very difficult to price, and hence very difficult for auditors to be able to assess whether something's going right or wrong. I think we've led to a degree of complexity which basically means it's not under anybody's control. And I think we then have to question whether we should allow banks to actually get to this level of lack of control, because clearly when something goes wrong, it's now on a scale that affects everybody. But it's not just about auditors. I do accept that point, but I think it's also about the compliance officers within the banks and also the non-exec directors on the board. For many of them, the whole thing is so complex now, they can't effectively control it.
And Jonathan Davis, our other economist who's on the line, a lot of people will point the finger at the regulators, but at least the FSA have actually identified the wrongdoing and they're doing something about it.
Well, they would say that themselves, wouldn't they? I would suggest to you there is no effective regulation in the UK or in the Western world of the financial services industry. Remember, many of these regulators go on to work for these financial services operations, so of course they are loath to take the action they need to take. I'll tell your listeners, because they may not know this, but the fraud of the likes of Bernie Madoff, of AIG, of Lehman Brothers, these companies which brought the economy to a standstill, to a collapse. The fraud basically took place in the City of London. So, the FSA, the Financial Services Authority, there's 3,000 people there. First of all, they didn't spot the biggest economic financial collapse in history before it happened. What are they doing? And years after the manipulation of a $350 trillion market, they're fining some banks. At the moment, one bank will be more. Where are the criminal prosecutions? The biggest economic and financial collapse in history. Where are the criminal prosecutions?
Yeah, but can we just regulate the UK market? Doesn't have to be done worldwide. That old argument will come back. That if we get tougher in Britain, what happens is a lot of the banks will leave. Is that the case, do you think?
Yeah. Where are they going to go? Deutsche Bank, it's being investigated for this. It's a German bank, but it's in London. Citibank's an American bank. It's in London. My point being, where are they going to go? They're still going to do these practices, maybe, but if they go here, where are they going to go? They're still going to. We've still got to ensure that they're not defrauding the system, which they're doing day after day.
Melville is in Dalgety Bay. What's your point?
Well, good morning, Graham. First, but listening to what I've just been listening to, I find it quite amazing that the Bank of England just gave them £100 billion to lend between each other. I find it quite amazing that we're sitting here after 5 years after the biggest crash in banks, and we're finding out they're nothing but gangsters. They have a rule for themselves.
But isn't this a different thing? Everybody was complaining about the banks not lending money to individuals and businesses. That injection was needed to get them to do that, surely.
Well, the Bank of England's pumped £350 billion with QE in the last 4 years. Where's that money went? It's went to the banks. It's ruined the private pensions because there's a shortfall in the pensions because they've been buying gilts. They've been hoarding money. They don't lend it out. So what's the point of all this? It's like a fraud, the biggest fraud that's ever been going. And I think instead of fining the bank, Barclays Bank, we should be getting £165 billion back, because people have been losing their houses, losing their jobs, losing their businesses, everything. And the banks have been sitting there with their hands on the seat.
Michael, you've heard Melville's list of complaints there. The banks have got a lot to answer for.
Well, they have, and you probably remember that there is a proposal to split the banks between the investment bank side and the commercial bank side, the product of the Vickers report that came out last year. And this is an attempt to ensure that you don't allow one side of the banking operations, the so-called casino side, to inflict the rest. Now, that is actually quite a difficult thing to do, but at least there is a step to actually put some more effective form of control in. Having said that, I think you need also to change the culture of banking. I said at the beginning, for most bankers, you can trust them, because if you look at the guys in the high street and the guys in the regional branches, they are a world away from the dealing rooms of London, where really a handful of people are controlling billions of money, and that's where the problems have been. So if you can ring-fence that, control that more effectively, and allow the other guys to actually get on with the client relationships that really matters to them, then at least you begin to change the culture. It won't happen overnight. It will take some time, but I think it's a bit of a wake-up call in terms of what we've seen in the last few months for banks to actually to change, A, their structure, and B, the way they go about their business.
Right, but this latest issue of the LIBOR rate isn't just a couple of, rogue people who've been caught at it. I mean, this is endemic, surely?
Well, actually, it probably is relatively few people in each bank. We don't actually know how many other banks that have been involved in this. But for that sort of market, however big it may seem, ironically, it's actually relatively few people who are actually controlling it.
Sure, but it was collusion among what we expect to be many banks.
That would seem to be the case, yes. But the actual numbers of people involved, despite the
Fair
size
enough,
of money, is relatively few.
But it does involve many banks, so it does suggest that it's not just one rogue bank then.
Oh, no, indeed not. I'm not suggesting that, but I'm just saying within the context of any one bank, the people who are effectively setting the interest rate for the day is a handful of people. And although they may be lots of handfuls of people, if you like, those are the guys who are really at the focal point here.
Yeah. Melville, what should we do?
Can I ask something?
Yeah.
Is it the case that the Bank of England didn't know this was going on?
Well,
sorry, you're asking me, Melville?
Yes, Michael.
I'd be amazed. I would be utterly amazed if the senior guys, there's already an allegation that senior managers did actually force some of their traders to take some of these positions. That's in the press reports today. If that is the case, then I would have to say that this responsibility goes beyond the trading floor, way up the line, and hence somebody has to be found accountable for that.
But what about the Bank of England's responsibility, as Melville's pointing out?
Well, the bank, well, it's not just the bank. You know, you do have compliance officers within commercial banks who are meant to keep a control and eye on what's going on to make sure everything is legal. And the problem is that most compliance officers, by and large, are out of their depth. They're not sitting on trading floors, they're sitting in their own offices, and more or less they're looking at paper rather than at people.
Well, can I ask this as well? If Robert Peston knew this, had an inkling this was going on, I find it hard to believe that the Bank of England would know this was going on as well. And I come back to the point, if they were going to lend £100 billion to the banks to lend between each other, then I find it quite amazing that they were going to do it in the first place.
But I think there are two issues here. The first is that we live in a world where there is a bit of a banking crisis and banks had stopped lending, forget the rates they're charging, but they'd stopped lending to each other because they felt there was a credit rating or bankruptcy risk. That's why the Bank of England acted like this, to make sure that the money continues to flow, because rather like power supplies, water, whatever, you need banking for the economy to keep ticking over. So you need those markets to continue operating. How they operate and who's responsible for setting interest rates, which is part of today's story, that's a different matter.
Let's take some of your texts here. Norrie says, trust the banks. It will be a long, long time. Greed is their downfall. Mr. Anderson says, boring retail banks from Philip. Another adjective could be added to the list. Greed. And Jerry in Airdrie says, the Alliance in Leicester were the cause of me almost being declared bankrupt. They would take payments out and then deal with the money going in. This meant some of the payments weren't made and ridiculous charges being made for stopping them and then letting me know. I tried speaking to them to ask for 1 week only deal with the credits. No, it doesn't make sense. Right, we'll move on. 80295. Let's go to Frank, who's in the Western Isles. Hi, Frank. What's your point?
Hi, Frank. Hi. Yesterday, the day before yesterday, I was renewing my European health insurance card for a holiday that's coming up.
Mm-hmm.
Went onto a website which I thought was a government website, but which is actually a scam website. And they charged me £14.99. The payment was made through the Clydesdale Bank. Spoke to the Clydesdale Bank yesterday, and they told me there was nothing they could do about it. Not only that, the member of staff that I spoke to admitted that they knew about it.
So what website was this? How did you get onto this website?
It's I googled European health insurance card. The European health insurance card is used throughout the whole of Europe. Everyone can get one. Doesn't cost you anything. But obviously, since I've had my first card, I thought maybe there was a fee, but apparently there isn't. And I discovered through actually another BBC programme that this is actually a scam. I phoned the Clydesdale Bank, and they said no, the payment has gone through, and the girl admitted to me that the bank knew it was a scam. The reason why was because some other customers had phoned, and that the day before yesterday, another member of staff, one of our colleagues, had the same conversation with her. So there's more than certainly two members of staff at the Clydesdale Bank know about this scam.
But the website is not obviously run by the bank, so can they be held responsible?
No, it's not, but they know about it. They know it's a scam. They've admitted to me that it was a scam, that they knew about it. So they're processing it. They're taking the fees from the scam website. So they're making a profit out of illegal activity.
So you don't trust the banks at all, then?
Oh, no, not at all. No, I wouldn't advise anybody to trust a bank.
But what should we do about the banks, though? Because we rely upon them, we depend upon them.
Basically, one of your speakers earlier said there should be criminal charges, and yes, there should be. If I were to steal money from somebody else, I would quite probably be taken to court and probably even put in prison. The bankers should be subject to the same laws as everyone else.
Yeah. Dorothy makes a good point by email here. Can someone please tell me and the rest of the public who actually gets the fine money paid by Barclays Bank? Jonathan, do you know at all?
I'm going to make an educated guess here that it goes to the Financial Services Authority, which then, therefore, it goes into the Treasury, or it helps pay for the Financial Services Authority salaries. And believe me, they earn a lot of money. Not as much as the bankers, but the FSA, the average income at the FSA is about £60,000 a year, and that includes the lowest earners.
Yeah. Michael, is that your understanding? You think it will go back to the FSA and back to Treasury?
Yes. Basically, it's part of their revenue. Whether it goes to the Treasury or is actually used within the FSA very much depends on what the FSA is up to. Remember, the FSA is being split, and part of it is going to the Bank of England, and part of it is setting up as a different agency. So they probably will be using the money, I would imagine, to affect that change.
The question this morning, then, can we ever trust the banks again? 0500 92 95 00. We're talking, of course, about this latest story involving Barclays and the manipulation of the LIBOR rate. That's the interest rate for banks lending to each other. But we're also looking for your thoughts on really banks generally and the kind of service that you get from them. Of course, last week we had the RBS group, which involves Royal Bank of Scotland and NatWest, with their glitch in their computer software, which affected thousands of people. Maybe you were one of them, looking for your stories. 0500 92 95 00. Were you left out of pocket because of this? Reading today that the problems are still ongoing. I think they've sorted out 99% of the problems, but some people are still waiting for money. If you're one of them, 0500 92 95 00. I wonder, Michael, what do you think is going to happen as a result of this latest Barclays scandal? Do you think people will end up in jail because of it?
I suspect they won't, mainly because, and I'm not a lawyer, but I think it will be very hard to pursue a criminal investigation. To date, this is seen as a civil action, may well be affecting other banks, so you may well find other fines are coming along. And I would have thought on the back of that you would find that the system, as Justin was indicating at the beginning of your programme, may change, and that it is actually supervised better than it has been of late. But whether this develops into a criminal case, I've got my doubts, simply because I think it's too complex and will take too much time.
Yeah. Jonathan, what do you make of Bob Diamond saying that he's going to forgo his bonus?
Laughable. The guy has earned, 100 or 200 million pounds over the past nearly 10 years. Believe me, foregoing his bonus this year to avoid losing his job and in going to prison, believe me, that's the least that he could do. Mr. Hughes there talks about the complexity of banking. One of your other callers talked about the auditors. Where are the auditors? Well, let me give you an example of how we could take these banks to task right now. They have got hundreds of billions of pounds of loans on their books, valued at 100 pence in the pound, that they know today that there's no way on earth they're going to get all the money back. For example, loans to Greece, loans to Spain, loans to residential mortgages, loans to commercial borrowers for property in the UK. And yet the banks are allowed to say to the auditors and the directors sign off, the accounts show a true and fair value of the state of our business. What absolute rot.
Yeah, and
we need to change that system.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because that was the cause of the original credit crunch back in 2008. Michael Hughes, it sounds like the banks have not learned their lessons from that crisis.
Well, I'd have to say in the case of the UK and the US banks, they did write down their debt. In fact, the Greek debt's been written down by at least 75%. Actually, some of the Spanish and European banks were very slow to do this, and they weren't being realistic. And hence the problems we've had in Spain in the last month or two is really their catch-up to adjust their balance sheets appropriately. And, of course, it exposes a large hole, hence the new capital that has to go in. So I don't think the writing down is something which the UK and US banks have been slow to do. I think actually they have done it. I think there is probably still more to do if you look at what's happening in Europe, but the European banks most certainly have been very, very slow to do this, and this basically has given us the crisis we've now got in Europe.
Bill's calling from Ayr. Bill, good morning to you. You've got a point about building societies.
Yeah, mine is a kind of point to pass to the public in general. In about 2005, I'd had such a messing about with the banks, and that's long before the financial crisis. And what I'd done was quite easily transferred from the bank to the building society. And for any normal run-of-the-mill person, the building society does all my financial direct debits and everything. And I'm away from the bank. And the main point is I am now a shareholder of the building society. And there's not just a small amount of shareholders collecting a lot of money. So I have nothing to do with the banks now. Then I would urge people to do that same thing, is leave the bank and go to a building society. The building society will be able to carry out all your functions that the bank does if you're just a normal, straightforward punter.
And in your view, why is the building society better then?
Well, it's just a general consensus since I went to the Building Society in 2005. I've never had a bit of bother with them. They've transacted all my financial comings in of pensions and all my going outs, and I've just never had any bother, none whatsoever. Whereas before I had a lot of problems with the banks, and I just feel that everything's been absolutely fine for me. And I have nothing to do with the banks. I kind of semi-take a pride in the fact that I've done the right thing, the way I see it, when I moved.
Jonathan, the building societies, I mean, since they've been privatised, are they as trustworthy?
Well, of course, most of the building societies are now actually banks. You use the word privatised. Yeah, sure, they are banks. The most notable building society, which is still a mutual organisation, is the Nationwide, and there are some very, very small other financial services organisations which are also cooperatives or mutuals. I would say that on the whole, they're probably not as in deep mire as the banking system generally, but I'd be very careful about just assuming because they're not incorporated banks that therefore their financial position is superb. Because they
can I
too.
Come in now?
Let me just
can I come in again?
Too. We're lending at 90+% on mortgages, at 95% plus on mortgages up to 2007. So once the housing market totally collapses, and I see house prices have fallen 2% in Scotland in the last 3 months, once house prices totally collapses, you watch the building societies, they're going to go down just like everyone else.
Bill, come back in.
Yeah, well, I just feel as though that he's missing the point. It's not to say that the building societies couldn't collapse. The financial markets of the world is unbelievable. But it's the fact that I'm a shareholder of that company. I'm involved with them. I don't have a small hierarchy creaming money off the top. And I feel that that's a lot better.
If you knew, sir, how much the chief executives and the senior managers of small building societies earned as a proportion of the size of the companies, you'd actually be pretty disappointed.
OK, let's go to Ronnie, who's in Helensburgh. Good morning, Ronnie.
Good morning. Regarding building societies and banks, the big difference is, of course, that the banks work on a 10% fractional reserve, and they only need to lose 10% of their money and they're broke if they lose their loans, whereas a building society is a 100% mutual society. And if it loses 10% of its loans, 90% are still there, and you don't get a chain reaction. However, the main reason I phoned this morning, Graham, if I may, is to ask this question. All banks have a charter from the government, and they can't operate without a charter. And I can't understand why our MPs are sitting on their hands, whilst all this banking mafia take the rest of us to the cleaners.
And what should they do?
Well, they should change the banking laws, They shouldn't debate with these fellas. Lord Miners, he's a banker. All the advice that government get is coming from bankers.
But they have been breaking laws, and they're now being found out. They're being found out,
and what's happening? They're getting a fine, which is a tiny fraction of the money they're making. This is a very good arrangement. And it all comes from America, of course, where the Treasury Secretary is a former director of Goldman Sachs. And there's just a succession of these people from the banking establishment who become Treasury Secretaries, and they write the laws. It's just not it's not a democratic process at all.
Absolutely correct. And if I can add to this, if you think about it, in the decades of the 2000s, the banks were making vast profits, which were, of course, illusory because it was based upon clearly they were going to break the system in a few years' time. And the politicians, they loved it because they were getting taxes in which they could fund all their activities. But then when the whole system collapsed, who did the politicians go to when the system collapsed? They went to the bankers. And what did the bankers say? The bankers said, you've got to bail us out. Well, do you know what? We're still bailing them out. We, the taxpayers, are still bailing them out. As someone quite rightly said, £100 billion a year. Let's stop bailing out the banks, and believe me, then we can start getting on with our economy.
Can we ever trust the bankers? 0500 92 95 00. Right, we're back to bankers, bashing the bankers in many cases. Let's go to George, who's calling from Dalkeith. Good morning, George. What's your point?
Hi there. I got my mortgage protection back from the bank.
Oh, right, good.
It was £700 to £800 I got back.
Mm-hmm.
I did get interest on top of that, but what my complaint is that I could have been overcharged with that amount, and I didn't get my charges back for it.
Yeah. Did you go to one of those companies that advertise to get the money back on your behalf, or did you do it yourself?
No, I just went straight to the bank.
Yeah, and it was a pretty easy process?
Yeah, that was pretty easy. They just gave me money, more or less. I did initially when I didn't actually even want it. They took debits off me twice, and I told it because the boy was actually annoying me when he kept on asking me if I wanted the policy, and I said I distinctly didn't want it to start off with. But they did put it on, but eventually, like 7 years later, I found I'd been paying my policy.
Uh-huh.
But like I say, the accrual of the money, the way I see it, the accrual of my money, whenever I've been overdrawn by that amount that I've paid to them, I'm paying charges for it, overdraft charges, which I shouldn't have been. And I've actually looked, the overdraft charges could have well been maybe £600-700 on their own themselves. Because if you're maybe paying £30 a month, you know, it fairly adds up.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so you got the money back from the PPI scheme, but the fact you missold that in the first place, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, it's fraudulent, basically, but, I mean, you don't seem to have I've actually, with regards to my charges, I've written to the FSA, and they're not interested. And I'm just thinking whether I should go to a solicitor if I've actually got any kind of complaint to make, but with regards to the actual selling it, it was fraudulent because the boy, I specifically said I didn't want it, and they put it on twice.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, how do you trust the banks?
Well, I mean, you don't basically, do you? I mean, but again, and also, I'd also like to point out that my view on that, you know, I've got internet banking, and every time I maybe phone the bank, they have got my bank account details, and they're offering me loans. So to me, that's unfair competition. It's something I've complained about as well, but they're constantly bombarded. To me, if they can see your account and they need your money, then to me, they shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, Michael Hughes, our economist, just generally, the banks surely are meant to work for our benefit. Are they working for our benefit?
Well, clearly there have been examples where they haven't been, and they've been found out. In fact, you might argue this whole policy protection insurance scam has been brought to light by the regulators who have forced the banks to give back the monies and indeed pay penalties. So to some degree that's an example of the regulation working. However, it doesn't get over the fact that these things are sold or missold in the first place. And so what you really need to have from all this is banking boards trying to change the culture of the banks so that people can get their trust back. I think that's a hard sell, and you may well find that there are some new banks coming through, be it Marks and Spencer's, be it Virgin, be it other companies, the Co-op is another one, where people think, okay, we probably can trust these guys. They have a reputation that they wish to establish, and it may be that source of competition forces the culture to change at the established banks.
But are they really new banks, though, like Tesco and Sainsbury's and all the rest of them? They're backed up by the established banks.
They are to some degree, but the people operating them are as yet untarnished by any of these problems. And I think that because they can see a competitive advantage, making sure that their reputational risk is controlled will be something that they will be much more keen to do.
Yeah, you wonder, Jonathan, with all the scandals we've had in recent times, why a brand like a Sainsbury's or a Tesco would want to get into the banking sector, given the damage it could potentially cause them.
Because it's very profitable. It's as simple as that. And the question was posed, do banks work for us? The answer is they are huge money-making machines for the bankers, not for the country. You know, this argument that we need the banking system because it's great for our country. I would challenge anyone to go through history and see where on a net basis over a long enough period of time a country has ever made a net profit out of the banking system when you consider how much money we are giving to the banking system right now. And Mr. Hughes earlier said that the Vickers report has said that we've got to split high street banks from investment banks. Well, first of all, if it comes in, and I'm not sure that it is, it's not going to come in for years. And secondly, it's not that we can trust the retail banks, the high street banks. The payment protection insurance is one thing. 150,000 complaints to the Financial Ombudsman Service because of banking mis-selling. No, the reason why we need to split high street banks from investment banks, because any time you deposit £1,000 into your high street, that's immediately in the casino in the investment community, and that's the reason why it needs to be split, and split ASAP.
Yes, gambling with our money. Stuart is in Glasgow. Hi, Stuart.
Hi there, how you doing?
What's your point?
It was just basically to say, I mean, as just being a kind of average member of the public, if I was to go into a bank and lie about all my credentials and lie about my financial capabilities and lie about absolutely everything to try and con money from them, basically, I would be utterly held to account. I would be hauled over the coals. I'd have any valuable assets that I have probably taken from me. I'd have criminal charges brought against me. I'd be charged for fraud. There'd be an endless list of things that I'd be getting penalised for. Now, in my opinion, unless the punishment for such an instance is scaled up to the level that these bankers are involved in and the appropriate charges are brought against them, it just proves how inherently corrupt the entire banking system is. These people are allowed to freely operate and just do whatever they want and never to be held to account for it, apart from potentially a slap on the wrist and a wee couple of £1 million fine, which is completely and utterly insignificant to somebody earning the level of money they do. It's just it's so completely and utterly wrong. The full system's just inherently corrupt. It's beyond any point of reasonability.
And how do you get on with your bank? What's your relationship like?
I absolutely hate all of them. I was a victim of the recession in the sense that I lost my job because of the errors that the bankers made. And at the time, I had a loan. I had a perfect credit rating at that point, but I lost my job, and the bank basically refused to help me in any way whatsoever. A bank that I'd been banking with for more than a decade. I had a perfect track record with them. I'd paid every single bit of credit I'd ever had, maintained my accounts well. And they basically just point blank refused to help me. They wouldn't restructure anything, and because of that, I fell into arrears and basically just get completely shafted by the bank at a point in my life where a good credit rating, which I'd worked for my entire life, was essential to progress and to the point of buying houses and things like that. So, I mean, I have absolutely zero faith in the banking system at all. The entire system basically needs to be broken apart and taken down. I mean, I heard one of your guest speakers saying that the system had gone beyond a point of control, that there was just so much going on, they wouldn't be able to control it anymore. I mean, I just completely and utterly refuse to believe that. The people that run the banking system are highly intelligent people. They are the architects of the system. They implement all the policies that they create on a daily basis. There isn't any way that I could believe that they don't have a grasp over it. They don't have full control over everything that's going on.
OK, Stuart, thank you very much indeed for that. A couple of texts here. One says, what a deterrent is a fine. We end up paying for it anyway. Facing charges is the only deterrent. Another one here says, you can't trust the banks and you can't trust British government, so continually defend and support the whole London financial centre. Thank you very much indeed for those. It's 9:42 now.